Let's continue where we left off. We mentioned that there was a question on the Radbaz because the Gemara seems to assume in Masechet Yevamot lo yilbash adam kelayim afilu lavriach es hameches, that havrochas hameches is asur, and the Gemara says that according to Rabbi Shimon, that would be mutter because it's a davar she'eino miskabed. He's not interested in wearing shatnez per se and benefiting from wearing it. He's just doing it in order to avoid the tax collectors. Yet the Rama paskins that it's asur. We don't allow a person to wear shatnez to avoid tax collectors. And that was the question that we ended with yesterday. The Radbaz offers the following distinction between Shabbos and the case of Kilayim. In Shabbos, the Rambam always paskins davar she'eino miskabed is mutter. He has no inhibitions, no compunctions. Whereas here, in the case of davar she'eino miskabed in Kilayim, the Rambam is machmir. Says the Radbaz, it's because people are somewhat laid back about shatnez. They're not as careful. It's not chomer beineim, it's kal beineim. And therefore, the Rabbanan took extra precautions. And in this case, they prohibited a davar she'eino miskabed because we allow you, in a case of a davar she'eino miskabed, then maybe next week or tomorrow, you'll wear the beged, the same exact beged, not to avoid the tax collectors, but because the Rabbanan allowed you to wear it to avoid tax collectors, you're going to jump to the conclusion that you're allowed to wear it in general, even if you have kavanah l'shem levisha. So the Rabbanan prohibited this. But in Shabbos, people are very, very machmir about Shabbos. They would not violate the Shabbos, and therefore davar she'eino miskabed, the Ram has no compunctions about being mat. It seems to me that there's room for research in a slightly different direction based on the Radbaz, that maybe we can differentiate between Kilayim and Shabbos, but in a slightly different direction. The Rambam is more inclined to be making on Shabbos because of the principle called moleches machsheves asur Torah. And in the case of a davar she'eino miskabed, the Rambam holds that in addition to the universal halacha of davar she'eino miskabed, there's a very specific halacha of davar she'eino miskabed with regard to Shabbos. And it's because there's no moleches machsheves. He's not really thinking out and deliberate about this malacha. Therefore, the Rambam is making without any zeros or siyagim or drabanans with regard to davar she'eino miskabed in Shabbos. Could be we could go even a step further and say, according to the Rambam, if it's not a moleches machsheves, it's not called a malach at all. But in the case of Kilayim, there we fit into the normal structure of gzeros. Now, you might wonder, why does the Rambam accept that gzera l'chumra in the case of Mavriche Ameches, whereas the Rambam permits Mocher Ksus to wear the begadim as long as they don't have kavanah. Now we're not talking about Shabbos, we're not talking about Meleches Machsheves, we're comparing two different Isurim, which are really one and the same. They're both Kilayim, just that this is Kilayim in the case of Mocher Ksus, this is Kilayim in the case of Mavriche Ameches. In the first case, the Rambam is Mekil. In the second case, he's Machmir. Why is that? And the impression that I have is that either the Rambam holds that this was a special heter that the Rabbanan allowed for the sake of Mocher Ksus. It's very important for them in terms of their livelihood. And if you have to pay the taxes, you'll pay the taxes. Or perhaps alternatively, in the case of Mocher Ksus, the Rambam feels that it's not considered hana at all. In other words, the hana that he's getting for relocating the beged from place X to place Y, that has nothing to do with the levisha element in the beged. As far as the levisha is concerned, that's just a pure hechedim. It's another way of transporting the beged. But in the case of Mocher Meches, of Mavriche Meches, there it's the levisha that exempts him from Meches. they don't charge you for that which you're wearing on your body. So he does have some element of kavana. Again, it's not kavana for the hanas levicha. He gets no benefit in protecting his body from the cold, but he does get some element of benefit which sets up a maisa levisha. In the case of mocher ksus, he has no benefit from the levisha whatsoever. If he only had a wagon, he would be able to transport his gadim, his kilayim in a wagon. In the absence of a wagon, he puts them over his body. It's really almost like a law where he drapes it over his body. There's no levisha, and it's like a davar she'eino miskaven in Shabbos where there's no ma'isa malon. Now he quotes the Mari Kurkus, and the Mari says that there's a fundamental difference here between these two cases of Mavriach HaSameches and the general halacha of davar she'eino miskaven. He says the following: in order for a person to violate the Isur of Lo Silvat Shatnez, he has to have kavana for levisha. In the case of Mavriach Es Hameches, says the Mari Kurkus, Eino Miskaven Levisha. He has no kavana whatsoever for levisha. It's a psik reisha, and therefore it's asur midin davar she'eino miskaven. But the Gemara says that Mavriche Meches is mutter. They're allowed to wear kilayim, according to Rav Shimon, who holds davar she'eino miskaven. What happened to psik reisha? And he writes that the Gemara in Bava Kama, if you read it carefully, is before the sugya of Abai v'Rava Delmi Travayu Modu Rav Shimon psik reisha. The Gemara doesn't know that Rav Shimon is machmir and accepts the shita, concedes to the shita of Rabbi Yehuda in the case of psik reisha. Gemara thinks that Rabbi Shimon went a step further and he held that a davar she'eino miskaven even in the case of psik reisha is mutter. And that's why the Gemara thinks that although Mavriche Meches, the levisha, is a psik reisha, but nevertheless Rav Shimon holds davar she'eino miskaven is mutter. L'maskana, moder Rav Shimon psik reisha, and therefore mocher ksus, Mavriche Meches would be asur even according to Rav Shimon, because moder Rav Shimon psik reisha lo yomas. That's why the Rambam codifies the halacha l'chumra in the case of Mavriche Meches. Now, in the next presentation here, in the Yalkut Biurim, he presents what's called Mishnas Rabbi Aaron, which is Rabbi Aaron Kotler. And on the one hand, I wanted to skip it because in my past experience, I find the language of Rabbi Aaron very, very different. But on the other hand, he does touch on some of the issues about davar she'eino miskaven. So what I suggest is we'll take a shot at it. We'll give it one round, a few minutes. And either it will engage our minds and we'll try to figure it out, or we'll leave it. But it's worth a try. For me, there's a lot at stake here because, as I said, I have sort of a almost a knee-jerk response. If you show me a sefer called Mishnas Rabbi Aaron, I actually own one of them myself, but there are many, many volumes. I immediately give it back to you. It's difficult for me to understand this language, but let's see. Maybe I shouldn't come with my prejudices. He says the following: there are two ways of defining Rabbi Shimon about a davar she'eino miskaven. One is the Torah, when it prohibits, it's not the Maisa Isur alone, but rather the Torah wants, in order for you to pass the bar and have violated an Avera, to have, in addition to the Maisa Isur, a ratzon, a kavana to violate that Isur. That's built in to the essential definition of a Maisa Isur. That's the Shita Rav Shimon. However, there's another way of understanding Rav Shimon. There's no requirement of kavana in Isur, but rather Rabbi Shimon is matir a davar she'eino miskaven because there are two mice. He's actually involved, he's osek in Maisa X, which is a Maisa Heter. And as a result, there's another Maisa, which is we'll call it a repercussion of the first Maisa. That second Maisa is the Maisa Isur. Rabbi Shimon holds that since there are two Maisa, Kavana allows me to tip the scale in favor of one Maisa over the other Maisa. So since he has Kavana for Maisa A, even though he did Maisa B, and even though Kavana is not an essential part of the Avera, but nevertheless, according to this understanding of davar she'eino miskaven, it's mutter. Even though Kavana is not an essential, it doesn't define the essence of the Avera. Why is it mutter? Because you have two Maisa. So let's take the classic case of Gorer Adam Kisei B'Safsa. He's involved in Grera, in dragging a couch. Another Maisa happens, and that is it makes charitzim in the ground on Shabbos, which is a Tolda B'Leches Choresh. However, since there are two Maisim, we're going to define his Maisa. We're going to choose and tip the scale in favor of his Maisa based on Kavana. Not because Kavana is essential to the Avera. The Avera is the Maisa Avera. The Kavana in this case, in this interpretation of Shimon, only plays a secondary role, and it allows us to, so to speak, cut the umbilical cord between the Gavra and the second Maisa. And instead, we relate the first Maisa, the Maisa for which he had Kavana to him, and the second Maisa is Memela. It happens. So what's the nafkamina between these two definitions? Says Rav Aaron, the nafkamina is psik reisha. It's a davar she'eino miskaven, but it's a psik reisha. According to the first side, that there's a separate condition and a requirement in a Maisa Avera that you have to have kavana. In the case of psik reisha, it becomes miskaven. That's the magic of psikration. It's not necessarily intuitively logical. He didn't have kavana to kill the bird. He chopped off its head, but chopping off the head means because there's a psikration that the animal is going to die, that you had kavana for killing the animal. But if we go with the second side, and that means that the chisaron of Eina Miskaven is in the Asiya, we relate the first Asiya of Miskaven to him and not the second, then we don't have to say that Psik Reisha is considered Miskaven, but rather what we're redefining is that there are not two Maisim here, there's really one Maisa. The Psik Reisha collapses the two Maisim into one. So again, according to the first definition that Rabbi Shimon holds, kavana is an essential condition in the Avera, then psik reisha magically sets up a kavana. It's a fulfillment of that requirement of kavana. According to the second shot, kavana is not part of the essence of the Avera. The issue is, can we separate his action into two and then determine that one relates to him and the other does not? And the answer is we cannot do that in the case of psikration. It's all one Maisa. So it doesn't mean that psikration magically gives him a kavana. He doesn't have kavana for killing the bird. From his perspective, let the bird live in Mashiach. But rather, asiyas ha'isur muchrachas mitoch ha'maisa v'nechshav asiyas ha'isur l'asiyah gemura. We don't consider his asiyah, in this case killing the bird, as a secondary asiyah, as a repercussion, as a spin-off of his first action, but rather that is his first action. He is killing the bird. cutting off the head of the bird is defined as a Maisa. Now, that's also a Kiddush, but it doesn't require going beyond human logic. It's certainly arguable that logically, intuitively, we see he's killing the bird. That's the nature of his Maisa. To say that he's miscoming to kill the bird when he yells and screams from the rooftops, Alavai, this bird should live biz Mashiach, that's already not intuitive. That already requires a major leap of faith. Okay. Now he wants to give a nafkamin. Until now, we were only dealing with definitions in the abstract sense. Now we get to a real practical nafkamin. And that's the case of lo nichale. So we have the classic case of lo nichale in the Gemara is hatzad chilazon v'potzo, which means that he's extracting the blood of the chisar, of the chilazon, which is a dye, dye, and it's inevitable that he's going to bring about the death of the chilazon. And the question is he chayav for the malacha of netilas neshama? And the Gemara vacillates back and forth according to Reb Shimon. He doesn't have kavana. In fact, the Gemara seems to indicate on the contrary. From his perspective, when he's extracting the dye, dye, it's better for him if the fish stays alive. Gemara says, I don't know the physics of it, but that the longer the blood is being circulated, the clearer is the dye. So that's called psik reisha de lo nichale. And here we have the shita sa'aruch, famous shita, that if it's lo nichale, then Rabbi Shimon would be matir, even though it's a psik reisha. So let's see how Rabbi Aaron weaves this in to his two definitions of davar she'eino miskabel. He says the following: if psik reisha is making him into a miskabel, then you can't call him a miskabel if it works against his interests. If killing the fish by or a result of extracting the dam is against his will, meaning he loses from it financially, it's not the same quality of dye, then how could you magically call psik reisha davar miskabel? But if, on the other hand, we go with the second definition, that we collapse it into one maisa, because, as we said before, cutting off the head of the chicken means killing the chicken, then extracting the dye from the chilazon means killing the chilazon. The enkar chisar betzem maisa. We're not able to downgrade the death of the chilazon to a secondary maisa, a spin-off maisa. It's really the maisa that he is doing. Not bad, I'm telling you the truth. I give myself a little bit of credit here because in the past, whenever I read Rav Aaron, it baffles me. But here I think I'm able to understand what he says. So a person has to give himself credit and feel good about what he accomplishes. Doesn't mean that he has to be, he has to realize that there's still a long way to go. All right. Now, we have, based on this, a new light on the Gemara in Pesachim. We have a machlokes on Daf Chaf Hei Amud Beis in Pesachim between Abaye and Rava about the shita of Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda holds davar she'eino miskabel is awesome. Abaye says that if he has no choice, that's called lo efshar, then Rabbi Yehuda is matir, even though he has kavan. So let's say, for example, there is, I should say, there is only one road to get from point A to point B. And on the way, there is a bakery of a monastery. And he smells and enjoys the smell of Avodah Zarah. That's called lo efsha. And according to Abaye, Rabbi Yehuda asks a davar she'eino miskaven only in the case of efshar. He had two possible pathways, two roads, and one passes the monastery, the other does not. He chose that path of the monastery. But if there's only one path, then says Abaye, Rabbi Yehuda would be moded that it's lo efshar and it's mutter. Rava disagrees. Rava says that Rabbi Yehuda's only matir if you could check off the following two boxes, the two conditions. Number one, it's lo efshar, and number two, it's eino miskaven. So in a case where it's efshar, even though it's eino miskaven, Rabbi Yehuda asks it, and that even Abaye's motive, but the nafkamina between Abaye and Rava is in the case of lo efshar v'kar macham, and he does have kavan. So when he passes by the bakery of the monastery, he takes a deep smell, and he enjoys the benefit of it. Abaye says that that's mutter because it's lo efshar, and Rava says that's also because it's miskav. So let's see how this machlokas Abaye for Rava will tie in to the two definitions of davar she'eino miskaven. He says mistaver lomar sheheter lo efshar eino mishum chisaron kavana. Abaye says that according to Rabbi Yehuda, it's mutter in the case of lo efshar. That has nothing to do with kavana. And Rabbi Yehuda says even eino miskaven is also. So why would Abaye say that Rabbi Yehuda's mutter in lo efshar? There must be a new category of lo efshar. Kevan she'eino yachol himana me'isur, since he can't avoid it, he has to get from place A to place B, and he has to pass through the monastery. Nechshav ha'isur kiba memela. V'eino nechshav k'maisa shelo. So if I understand it correctly, here the waters are getting a little bit rough. I think what he's saying is that Abaye could only make sense if we assume that davar she'eino miskaven sets up two mice. So, for example, let's take Rav Shimon. Rav Shimon holds davar she'eino miskaven is mutter because the second Maisa is a spin-off and it's a secondary action. His kavanah was for the first Maisa. Now, Rabbi Yehuda asks davar she'eino miskaven. Meaning he rejects that condition that Rabbi Shimon adds to an avera, that it's got to be miskaven. In below efshar, eino man. Mehechi tesi shiyatir below efshar v'eno miskaven. Let me just read another line. He says, "V'kach so Rabbi mikan oyachrecho the af below efshar levad mati Rabbi Yehuda mishum chisaron ba'asiyah." Meaning, even Rava agrees there was never an issue that Rabbi Yehuda is matir if you have two conditions, if it's Eino Miskaven and Lo Efsha. So Abaye asks the following question. What are you going to tell me, that Rabbi Yehuda is matir in Lo Efsha, Lo Kamachaven, because you have both conditions? That doesn't make any sense. Rabbi Yehuda holds that Dover Sheni Miskaven is awesome. So what good is it if you add Lo Efsha? The only possibility here is that Lo Efsha is the matir, according to Abaye's understanding of Rabbi Yehuda. We'll see how Rava deals with this. But we understand very well that Abaye could not possibly understand the matir of Lo Efshar in Lo Kamachavin unless Lo Efshar is in itself a matir. Even in the case of Kamachavin, it means that, forgetting about the machlokas between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon, where the Lo Kamachavin is a matir, we have one tool which operates according to both Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon, irrelevant to the issue of Eino Miskaven or Miskaven, and that's Lo Efsha. So now we go back and reread what we read before, and he says the following. Just have to find the place. Oh. Is mistaber that kevan she'ena yochel limona mea iser. This is called lo efshar. Nechshav ha'isur kibba memela. It's not considered his ma'isa. So Abaye's logic is that if Rabbi Yehuda, in rejecting Rabbi Shimon about Dover Sheni Miskaven, maintains that kavana is not essential to the avera, so why would he be matir? Which again, everybody agrees that Rabbi Yehuda is matir in the case of lo efshar lo kamachav, because lo kamachav, according to Rabbi Yehuda, doesn't mean a thing. He doesn't require kavana. So we have no choice but to assume and postulate that lo efshar is a category of its own, and a mice that was done bid a lo efshar is considered as if it happened may elov. He's not the implementer. He's not the initiator of that mice. Therefore, kach sover Abaye, she'af below efshar levad mati Rabbi Yehuda, and the reason for that is it's not called his asiyah, but rather it's ki'ilu nasebela. Rava, a heter einu miskaven, gam hu mishum chisaron ba'asiyah, below mishum chisaron kavana, v'al ken lo nechlak Rabbi Yehuda al heter zeh ela b'di efshar. Avol mode b'di lo efshar, Shumotor keva de b'chai gavna nechshav ma'isa isur l'ma'isa de b'meila. Ye'ein ha'ma'isa misyachas la'os. So Rava holds that the entire issue of Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon revolves around whether it's considered your Maisa or it's a Maisa de Mimela. Rabbi Yehuda holds that even in Einu Miskaven, it's still considered your Maisa, unless it's lo efshar. Says Rava, if it's lo efshar, v'lo kamachaven, then it's considered a Maisa de Me'elof. The Maisa took place, it happened, but it's not your Maisa. Why? Because number one, you didn't have kavanah, and number two, you had no choice. It was lo efshar. On the other hand, Abaye understood that the machlokas Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon revolves around kavanah. Rabbi Yehuda drops the requirement of kavanah, but in the case and then in the case of lo efshar, we have no choice but to set up lo efshar as an independent matir. It couldn't be, as Rava would have it, that it's lo efshar top, standing on the shoulders of lo kamachamin, because Abaye understood that lo kamachamin is only a factor according to Rabbi Shimon, but not according to Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda couldn't care less whether they had kavanah or not. So what's lo efshar? Lo efshar is an independent matir, then it has to operate even in the case of kol machaven. Whereas Rava is operating not with miskaven or eno miskaven, but rather Rava is operating with what we call a maisa de b'meila. And Rava says that Rabbi Yehuda would be modeh to Rabbi Shimon to be matir if I have two reasons together that overlap to make it into a maisa de b'meila. Number one, he has no kavanah, and number two, it's lo efshar. Nimsa lefizeh, shenechleku Abaye v'Rava b'din psik reisha delo nichol. Shel Abaye. Okay, let's see if we can guess what Rabbi is going to say here. According to Abaye, we're dealing with kavanah. One second. According to Abaye, according to Abaye, let's see if I'm right. Moder Rab Shimon b'psik reisha, that makes it into a davar miskav. Whereas according to Rava, Moder Rab Shimon b'psik reisha means that it's all considered one mice. Let's see if I'm right. He says, Yisoda heta b'einu miskaven u'chisaron kavana. That's going to Rab Shimon and Abaye. V'kol shelo nichole eino nechshav l'miskaven apu b'psik reisha. Rava, so she Yisoda heta b'einu miskaven hu machmas chisaron ma'isa. Kol b'psik reisha nechshav l'asiya gemura. V'ein afkamina b'zeh b'einu nichole o lo nichole. Okay. Now we get to the punchline. If we can get by the next paragraph, then we have a whole shtickle Torah. Now we get to the case of Mavriche Meches. The Arze yesh lo shehalovesh kilayim kidei lavriach es hameches af she'eno miskaven lanos levicha. Areu kipsik reisha delo nichol. Whoa, that's a jump. Secretion meaning we have no doubt that he's gonna get some benefit from wearing the beged. As we said yesterday, it's not layers and layers. But nevertheless, he has no kavana because he doesn't need the beged shel kilayim. But I'm not sure why. Maybe because he has other begadim. I'm not sure exactly why it's lo nichale. But he says it's considered a psikration to lo nichale. And now it depends upon how do we paskin in the machlokas abai v'rav. Now it's a little tricky because I don't know if you can search through the Rambam. I'm not sure, and determine how do we paskin, because the machlokas Rava and Abai is really in Rabbi Yehuda. We don't paskin like Rabbi Yehuda. But in any event, theoretically, in any machlokas in Abai v'rav, we always -6. We always paskin like Rava against Abai. Valkain. Shaper Osar Rambam was there in the case of Mavriach Hasaris wearing Kalayim. Mishum Shupose Rava, and according to Rava, even in the case of Sikresha Delo Nichale, it's awesome. No, it's Moder of Sikresha means even in the case of Lo Nichale. And assuming Mavriche Meches is lo nichale, which again, that piece of the puzzle I'm not exactly 100% sure about, because I was assuming he has no other clothing on, so it's really nichale, but maybe he's wearing enough clothing underneath so that he can get by. Yeah, that point, don't test me on that. I don't know the answer. Aval sugyas hagemara b'Bava Kama told it din zeh, meaning Mavriach Meches b'Machlokas Rabbi Yehuda Rav Shimon nemro leheja aliva de Shmuel. So that sugya in Bava Kama quotes Shmuel. He's the Baal HaMemra. Ushmuel islay dabayit. Well, that's news. That's nice. Was nice. It said Shmuel holds like a bike. Yesoda heter b'psikresha hu mishum chisaron kavan. I think he means psikresha lo nichal. Meaning that Shmuel understood that psikresha lo nichale is mutter, and that works out according to Abai, because Abai says that Dover Sheni Miskaven through psikresha becomes a Miskaven unless it's lo nichale, and Shmuel accepts the heter of lo nichale. He must be accepting Abai. The alkein mativ psikresha lo nichale. I'll leave it there. Shekain das Rabbi, Shekain das Shmuel b'Zvachim. I'm going to guess what daf it is in Zvachim without looking. Somewhere in the tzadis. Let's see if I'm right. Tov Zion. Not bad. Tzadi Aleph. ING. But that's not because I know Zvachim. It's only because this is a very famous sugya called, I even remember the name of the sugya, Mezalfin Ishim al Gabe Hamaroch. Meaning, if a person takes an adava of bringing a nadav of yayin, so we're allowed to pour the yayin on the marocha, on the Eish HaMizbeach, even though it extinguishes the fire on the Mizbeach, which is the lav d'oraisa of lo yichbeh. Why? Because he has no kavan. Ushmuel matir l'zalif yain al gabi ishim afal gav shu mechabes ha'esh bekach. The yesh posei isu mishum lo yechavu b'vur sham taimo mishum to davar shenim iskavim mutter. The hikshu rishonim arei psik reshahu. So how could Shmuel be matir ziluf yain al gabi mizbech in violating lo yechaber, and it's a psik ratio? You'll tell me he's a davar shenim iskavim. The only way out is to invoke the principle of the aruch of psik ratio lo nichal. And Shmuel is the one who interpreted the sugya in Bava Kama of Mavriche Meches that it's also according to Yehuda, but it's mutter according to Shimon. How can it be mutter according to Shimon? It's a psik resha. And the answer is it's lo nichal. So the psik resha is that he is involved in a ma'aseh levisha. The lo nichal is on the hana that he gets from this levisha. Wow, that's a shtickle. Okay. Now, the next piece I would like to do with you, but on my priority list, I also have, making progress in the Gemara itself. So we'll see how we juggle that time in the next 2 or 3 days, because I really am anxious to get to the sugya here on Daf Hey Amud Beis. So we're now on Daf Hey Amud Aleph, and we got up to the derivation from a Nazir Mitzorah. A Nazir, as we said yesterday, will override his Isur of Tiglachas for the sake of the mitzvah of Mitzorah if he's also at the same time a Nazir and a Mitzorah. And a Mitzorah, in the context of his Tara, he has to cut off his hair, and he will violate, or shall we say, override the Isur Tiglachas of a Nazir, because the Torah went out of its way to add the word Rosha, which was totally superfluous, since the pasuk says Yigalech es kol sa'ar. So this becomes the source for Esei Docha Lo Saseh as a general universal rule in Kol Torah Kula. And again, even though the Iser Giluach of a Nazir is again a Lav Shein Shav B'Kol, but we have an Eino Inyan. So the Gemara asks, Ika Lemifra, right? So let's just count how many lines it is before the end. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 lines up before the end of Hey Amud Aleph. Malin Nazir Mitzorah Shekain Yeshno B'She'ela. Forget about the fact that it's a Lav Shein Shav B'Kol. That we already got away with that because of the Eino Inyan. But I now have another problem. The Lav of Nazir is Kal, it's lower on the echelon because it's Efshar B'She'ela. So once again, we cannot derive other Isurim from Nazir that Esei Docha Lo Saseh. In the case of Nazir, Esei Docha Lo Saseh, because the Lotaseh is a weaker Lotas. Says the Gemara to Elo Tema Hachi. If you're not going to agree with me that the Isur of Nazir is an Isur Kal because of Yeshno B'She'ela, then you're going to have a problem. Hada Kaimelon the Ein Essay Docha Losa Savi Essay is Ligmar Mi Nazir. Why don't we derive the opposite conclusion from Nazir? Because Nazir has two sides. Number one, Tar Lo Yavar Al Rosho, which is a mitzvah lo taseh. But the Torah also commands the Nazir, Kadosh Yeh Gadel Pera Siar Rosho. So if you see a Nazir, next time you see a Nazir and he's got very long hair, you'll realize that not only does he have long hair because he's avoiding the lotus to the violation of Tar Lo Yavar Al Rosho, but he's also being Mekayim an essay. Because the Torah commands us, Kadosh Yeh Gadel Pera Siar Rosho. When he grows his hair, that act of growing his hair is a Kiyum mitzvah. We could never possibly derive from Nazir that essay docha losas, because if you would allow yourself to apply that principle, then you would go a step further that essay docha losas every essay. So that we could not derive essay dochalos of the essay from Nazir. Why not? It'll be Nazir my time alo gabrina. The ika lemifrach shekain yeshno b'she'elo is hachanami. Ika lemifrach shekain yeshlo she'elo. So the bottom line is we still don't have a source for essay dochalosas, according to the Chachamim of Tanna B'Rei Rabbi Shmuel. Elo liolam. Now we turn to the Afayim Beis. Mikra Kama. We go back to Smichas HaParshios between Kalayim and Tzitzis. You'll tell me it's not Mufne because we need it Legufe. Im Keim Lemakra Tzitzis Paselecha. Gedilim Lamali Shmamino Lafnuye. In the Parsha of Tzitzis, the mitzvah is tzitzis. Over and over again, the Torah repeats the word tzitzis. Here, the Torah switches the word tzitzis for gedilim. And that's called afnuye. Now, I think at this point, the Gemara is expanding its definition of afnuye. Meaning, if the word tzitzis was in the pasuk, it would not be afnuye. So there really is no extra word over here. We need the word tzitzis. Instead, the Torah plugs in the word gedilim. And that creates what's called afnuye. Not the classic afnuye. It's a different kind of afnuye. It's an afnuye which is based on the unusual usage of a term to replace the normal usage of a term. So the Gemara now asks, hi, this change from tzitzis to gedilim, l'shiura hudi asa. It's coming to teach me many chutim you need on each corner of your garment. How do you see this from the word gedilim? Or it should have said gedil in the singular. Gedil means to like wrap it up. Second. So if gedil would mean that you put one chut in each corner of the beged, and then you fold it over, so you have two chutim. But since the Torah says gedilim, therefore you need two chutim, and you double it over and you get four. Gedil shnayim, because you take the gedil and you fold it over. But gedilim in Rabin is arba, is four chutim, which is really two long chutim, but when we fold it over, it makes it into four chutim. Gedil who posleu mitoch. So again, without getting into all the nuances, which we're going to have to do, in general, what the Gemara is saying is that the word gedilim is not mufna. We need the word gedilim to teach us how many chutim we need on each corner of the beged. The Torah just says tzitzis. But gedilim, in the plural, is going to teach us how many chutim you need. Now, how does that operate? The Gemara says, "Asay gedil." So again, we now came to the conclusion that gedilim shnayim means that you have four chutim, right? Two that are folded over on each side. Now it says posleu mitocha. What is posleu mitocha? Let me read to you what he says here. Got a long note here, but in any event, he says, "Umitoch hagedil yatsu psilim shehem chutim prudim." Behind shelo yases hachutim lechol orcham gedil bekricha, ela bechelkom asamach lebeged yase gedil ulamata mimenu yase chutim prudim. Umeachar shehetzricha haTorah l'shanos v'lichtov loshen gedilim kidei l'lamdenu es minyan achutim. Yeah, it goes back to minyan achutim. But the main point here is tosleu mitocho, that from the gedil you have psilim shem chutim prudim. What is this chutim prudim? which is called posleu. Posleu means make chutin prutin. Do you have this? Maybe you have a. I once had. I don't know where it disappeared. I had an art scroll. Trying to figure out what this chutin prutin means. The Meiri, he quotes a Meiri here. I don't know if this is going to help us. Shanaf nikra psil. V'nimtza hanaf yotze mitoch hagedil. Vaynu shelo yehi hanaf samoch lebeged v'hagedil besof hapsilim el hashezira lemalov hanaf lemata. Whoa, this is complicated. Also chut shekorech bo et shara chutim af hu yehei miminyan achutim. Well, that makes a little bit more sense. He writes, "B'tosus rotzel lefarisha kavana sheyases hatzitzis ke'ein psila sheyichpol as hatzitzis b'toch hakanaf." So I don't see anyone who says explicitly that the 4 becomes 8. I was hoping to find that. So in any event, just to get by this sugya right now, because again, I just want to get to the main sugya here. We have a beautiful sugya coming up of Kibbut Ava'im, which I'm very eager to get to. So at this point in the sugya, the Gemara thinks that Gedilim Tasalacha is not mufna. We need it to establish the minyan chutei atzitzis. How many chutim of tzitzis do we need? So the Gemara says, no, it is mufna. Why? In came lema kra, the pasuk could have said, lo silba shatnes semru fishte. Yachtov lomali. So it's not that we're deriving it from Gedilim, but from the lav of Shatnez. We thought that the mufna was in the midst of tzitzis, whether it's because it says Seru Pishtin Yachtov, or now because it says Gedilim. The Gemara is shelving that. The mufna is because of something that's extra in Lo Silva Shatnez. And that is the word Yachtov. Yachtov Lomali. Lafnuya. And now the Gemara is going to go into the laws of Kilai. Vakati, it's still not mufna. Boile, I need this drasha of Yachtov, litochev shtei pchifos. And it's not enough just to put the pishtan into the beged, you have to do a tefira, right? You have to sew it together. The Semer and the Pishton have Yachtov, they have to be sewn together. You need a minimum of shtei tfiros or shtei tchifos. And that's called chibur. And at that point, he violates Nisa Kalayim. But v'tchifa achas, if he only like puts the needle in on one side with his pishton and it comes out on the other side, which is tzemer, so the connection and the tefira between tzemer and pishton is only one. Is eno chibur. In other words, he doesn't violate the Isa Kilayim unless he does a chibur of shtei tfiras. But one tchifa, one tfira, is not enough. I'm assuming that that applies even if he would tie a knot, but it's only one tefira. He's eno chibur, v'eno over mishum kelayim, shekain mashma loshen yachtov. We're going to learn from the word yachtov shiu mechubarim yachad heitev, that the pishton and the semer has to be connected in a very strong way. And now we need the pasuk of Silvat Shatnes Semer Pishtin Yachtov to teach me the halacha of shtei tfiros, of chibur. How can we use now the smichas aparshis to tzitzis to derive esei dochel losas? It's not mufna. Okay, so at this point, we'll take a break for the day. And I appreciate that you're bearing with me. It's, this is very detailed in the laws of Kilayim, and we're trying to come out of the sugya with our head above water.